Young Tarwater is an orphaned boy who has been raised in a backwoods cabin by his mad, moonshine-making uncle. This boy, Tarwater, leaves his home and his uncle, and he goes into the city for the first time. I don't know whether you read Flannery O'Connor on this campus, but, you know, it's always bizarre. Looking around, he observes that you have to do something particular here to make them look at you. They ain't going to look at you just because you're here. Tarwater senses that what characterizes the home, even his very eccentric and impoverished home, is that in it, one can be expected to be looked at, thought about, and cared for just because you're here. Tarwater senses that what differentiates the home from the rest of the world is that in it we are cared for and thought about because of who we are rather than what we do. We all need to be thought about and paid attention to, and the home is the privileged place for this to happen. When someone shoots up a church and kills children who are attending an all-school mass, we first ask who was the gunman, but then very quickly, what kind of family is he from? What was his home like growing up? This may not be fair, especially to his parents, but it is instinctive. We have a sense that the quality of the home directly impacts the human flourishing of those who live there. We all need a good home. I hope that you all grew up in homes where you were thought about and paid attention to. But we can all imagine, and perhaps some of you have experienced, a home in which this doesn't happen. A home where residents may find food and shelter and clean laundry and a good Wi-Fi connection, but in which there is minimal human contact. Residents pass like 2 ships or 5 or 6 ships in the night. This morning, I've been invited to talk to you about the thoughtful home, my term for the kind of home where you are looked at, thought about, and cared for just because you're here. I say we all need homes, by which I mean not just those of us in this auditorium or on this campus, but all human beings, and all human beings throughout time, right? Throughout all eras of human existence. All human beings around the world and throughout every era. The home, in fact, is a uniquely human institution. Animals do not really have homes. We sentimentally and anthropomorphically think of nests and dens and burrows as their homes, and consider like the home of Mr. and Mrs. Beaver in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But in reality, animals live in habitats, not in homes. To be careful here, because my son is a biologist and knows a lot more about this than I do, but you know, I think I've cleared most of this with him. Unlike we humans, they do not need homes in order to flourish. All a squirrel needs in order to flourish as a squirrel, to be perfectly squirrely, is instinct and an adequate habitat. Squirrels just don't make mistakes. They don't make bad decisions. They don't screw up. This is true of every animal with the exception of man. And why is this? For the glorious reason that human beings are free. We have instincts, but we aren't bound by them. We are free to act against instinct, to act against our human good. We can do things that we know aren't good for us, right? To act contrary to our human nature. And therefore, it is possible for us to become inhumane, to become monstrous. And we are likewise free to transcend our instincts and act in a supernatural way to become saints. You know, it's not instinctive to sacrifice our life for another, right? We have that, you know, instinct for survival, but we can transcend that and sacrifice our life for another. Because of our freedom, we need affection, encouragement, education, correction, discipline, formation, inspiration. We need these things when we are babies and young children, but we also need these things throughout our entire lifespan. Our purpose is not just to survive long enough to continue our species. Our purpose, whether we know it or not, is to know him and love him and serve him in this life and to be happy in heaven with him forever. What we need for this is found most fully and reliably in the home. Not exclusively in the home, but most fully and reliably. I would like to argue this morning, as I've done in my book, that although human beings have always needed homes, in our times, human beings need something more. We need thoughtful homes. Thoughtful is a great English word with two related but distinct meanings. It's actually, my book is being translated into Spanish, and it's been really interesting because there's just not the same word in Spanish that we have in English that has these two levels, these two kinds of meanings. It means marked by careful thought or consideration, as in a thoughtful essay, right? You know, she wrote a thoughtful essay. She really thought through and made a good argument for what she was doing. But it also means showing consideration for the needs and well-being of others, as in a thoughtful gesture. Both senses of the word describe the home which is so needed today. So let's consider why. Again, I emphasize that this need for thoughtful consideration for a home which is deliberately and thoughtfully made and kept is new. That doesn't mean that there haven't been thoughtful homes all throughout human history. Of course there have been, but it's particularly necessary today. Now, my husband and I, Jack's parents, are both trained as medievalists, and because of our training, we often look at current problems, at contemporary crises as nothing new. Scandals in the church. Hold the 10th century's beer. A global pandemic. Come on now. You know, behold the Black Plague, right? So when I say something is new, I really mean it. What has changed in the way that we approach the home? Human beings do not live in a vacuum. We always exist in a culture. And cultures, unlike human nature, vary widely across geography and across time. By culture, I mean nothing more complicated than a shared way of life. So we can talk about the culture of you marry, or the culture of your dorm floor, or the culture of Green Bay Packers fans. But the power of culture should not be underestimated. Years ago, we had a house guest staying with us for a few weeks, a college friend of my husband. In the kitchen one day, as I opened a new jar of salsa, our guest took the empty jar and moved toward the recycling bin. Without a second thought, I grabbed the jar from him, and with a rubber scraper, I transferred the tablespoon of salsa that was still in that empty jar into the freshly opened jar. He looked at me confused. You have a full jar of salsa. Why would you scrape out that empty jar when you had a fresh jar at hand? I looked back at him equally confused. Why would anyone toss out a tablespoon of perfectly good salsa? We'd been raised in different homes, and what was second nature to me was odd behavior to him, and vice versa. What had never occurred to him to do would never have occurred to me not to do. This is the power of culture. Culture, in a sense, takes the place of instinct in animals. It gives us ways of acting and reacting, which we don't really think about. I mean, we can think about it, but we don't, we often don't think about it because it's just in the culture. A healthy culture leads us to act unthinkingly in good ways, and a negative culture, a culture which prizes above all not human flourishing, but wealth or convenience or fame, will lead us to act in inhuman ways. The culture we are all immersed in, again, whether we like it or not, is very strong and marked with very little regard for the human good. We refer to it as consumer culture. And I think that is accurate. Our broad American culture, which of course spreads to every other culture in the world because of our reach and influence, our broad American culture has always prized independence and efficiency. We've always wanted to get a lot of bang for our buck. We've always admired self-reliance. And that's gotten us a long way in world domination, right? I mean, that's part of the reason that we take on huge projects as Americans and we solve them, we fix them, we get things done. But these values in American culture have always existed in tension with other values like loyalty, justice, family, stability. If you read the Laura Ingalls Wilder novels, or you read Wendell Berry's Hannah Coulter, for example, in those novels you see that tension between self-reliance and between interdependence and all of that kind of thing. What's more is in the past, our love of efficiency and self-reliance was limited by just the real circumstances of life. The pioneers who settled these Great Plains loved self-reliance, but they also knew that if they didn't band together as a community, there wouldn't be a school for their children or a church to worship in. Within the span of my lifetime, however, Our culture has been so strongly impacted by increasing wealth and technological advance in the form of the market, the internet, the smartphone, that independence and efficiency threaten to sweep away so much of what is necessary for the human good. So think of the culture as a current in the ocean or the wind when you're sailing. That current doesn't care where you want to go. It doesn't care where you need to go. If you abandon yourself to the current or to the wind, you will almost certainly end up not where you want to be. Our cultural current is very strong, and it doesn't care about our eternal destiny or our human flourishing. Our cultural current is mainly concerned with maximizing our consumption. And if we abandon ourselves to that current, we will end up miserable, debt-ridden, and in many cases, fat. But here's the good news. We are not squirrels. We are not flotsam and jetsam floating on the surface of the water. We are human beings, and we are free. So we don't have to be slaves to the culture or victims of it, any more than a sailor is a slave to the wind or to the current. We can reject the culture, we can change the culture, and as a good sailor does, we can use the currents of the culture to our advantage, to get where we want to go. But to do that, we have to know where we are going, and we have to be thoughtful. Which brings us back to the home. So the home is my area of expertise and my area of culture, like my domain. The home is an important part of the culture. I would argue the most important part of the culture because it impacts all of us, not just at a certain time of our life, but throughout our whole lives. It impacts us intimately and integrally, our physical well-being, our emotional well-being, our intellectual well-being, our spiritual well-being. And if you think I'm overstating it, because this is my area of expertise, and so I see it, the need for it everywhere, ask a doctor whether the quality of a patient's home impacts his health or his recovery. Ask a therapist whether the circumstances of a patient's home impacts his mental health. Ask a teacher whether the quality of the home impacts a student's ability or readiness to learn. Ask Bishop Barron or Monsignor Shea whether the home that a person is raised in impacts the likelihood that he will practice the faith. And not only does the home impact everyone, but every one of us has an impact on our homes, whether we're a full-time homemaker or a young child, a primary breadwinner gone from the home 10 hours a day, or a college student who is only home on holidays. The culture of our home matters to every one of us, and every one of us has an impact on the culture of our home, for good or for ill, whether we know it or not. Hence the importance of the thoughtful home. So let's think about the home together. We're talking about the thoughtful home. Now, I've written a book about the home. As you know, I've written a book called The Thoughtful Home. So let's not pretend that I'm not ahead of you in thinking this through. Apparently, I was ahead of my son as well. Nevertheless, I want you to think with me. I didn't write a book that told homemakers how to make a home. When I was trying to get it published, actually, this was hard for publishers and editors to get. Like, what are you doing here? Tell me how to make a home. Like, isn't that what we want? Rather, I wrote a book exploring what a home is and what it's for, so that homemakers could think about and decide for themselves, for their own circumstances, their temperament, the number of kids they have, their economic circumstances, their taste and interests and strengths and weaknesses, and even their culture, because I hope it will be read all over the world. What sort of house, what sort of contents, what sort of routines and practices would make a home which fosters human flourishing of their family and of themselves? I want you to think along with me, because you are the one who knows your home. You will be the one who has the power and responsibility to make the home that your family needs. So what is a home? We have a mental picture of a home. We all have one. It's probably different. Every single one of us has a little bit different picture of a home that's particular and concrete. Maybe you have an image of your family home or your dream home, or maybe a house you see depicted by an influencer or on a television show, or maybe a home from literature. I find myself extremely formed by the homes in the Little House books. So I don't know how many of you read the Little House books, but I can tell you everything that's in them, But let's abstract from these particular homes and try to come up with a definition of a home. That is, what a home is and what it is for. A lot of times people get impatient with definitions. After all, we know what we're talking about. We know how to use the word. And if we need a formal definition, it's just a Google away. But let's slow down. Seeking a definition is not a mere grammatical exercise. It's eminently practical. So consider a knife. We all know a knife when we see one. We know how to use the word correctly in a sentence. But if we don't consider what it is that makes it a knife and not something else, what it's designed to be used for, then we will do something inconsiderate. We will pick up that good chef's knife that happens to be close at hand and try to pry open a paint can with it. And we will ruin the knife because we didn't think about what a knife is for. So bear with me as we think about the definition of the home. The dictionary, or Google, tells us that the home is a dwelling place of a family, but this is inadequate. These days, and likely in all times and places, there are many, many houses, dwelling places, where families live, and they really aren't homes in any meaningful sense. They're more like boarding houses or dormitories, places where the residents keep their stuff, spend the night, eat some food. But something important is missing in these places. We would never call them homey. Instead, let me offer this more complete definition of a home, not as artful as O'Connor and not original to me, but it's my operating definition. A home is a material structure organized to promote the physical and mental well-being of the family members, as well as their character formation and their intellectual and spiritual formation. And if you just think about, like, what's a boarding house? A boarding house is not that, what I just described. A home is something, it's a subset, I guess, of residences, right? I think we can shorten this simply to home as a material structure organized for the human flourishing of the family which dwells there. So there's three key elements in this definition. First, a home consists of a material structure. This can be a suburban McMansion, a split-level ranch, a studio apartment, a log cabin. But it's a material thing. It's not just an idea. It's not just a concept. We say, like, home is where the heart is. But a home has a street address. Someone who has no known address is precisely homeless. Because the home is a material structure, it needs to be cared for. Nothing material can long survive without upkeep and maintenance. Secondly, a home is organized for a purpose. An RV parked in a driveway is not a home, although it is a material structure. But the minute someone says, if I put a bookshelf in here and I stock the fridge, it wouldn't be so bad, we could live here. Then it can become a home, right? Someone's organizing it for a purpose. I always like the example of the Boxcar Children, if you're familiar with that charming book from your grade school days. An abandoned boxcar is not a home, but the Boxcar Children turn it into a home by organizing it for a purpose. Thirdly, the purpose of the home is the well-being of the family who lives there. I like to say the human flourishing of those who live there, not just their material survival, but their emotional health, their moral development, their intellectual life, their relationship with God. Those who live there is usually a family, even in these days, but it could be a group of roommates. It could even be someone living alone. The home is a material structure organized for the human flourishing of the family who lives there. So pay attention to this. The purpose of the home is to foster and protect and ensure the well-being of those who live there. The home cannot be reduced to a set of services, a stocked refrigerator, a bed, a shower, storage space, Wi-Fi. A home is not a hotel. Making a home is not about checking off a list of tasks. It's not about purchasing a set of supplies. It's about caring for people. We can think of the home as an instrument used in the care of those we live with. Like that knife, it is an instrument made for a purpose and used for a purpose. The purpose of determining the needs and meeting the needs of those who live within so that they can flourish, and flourish broadly as human beings. Okay, we have our definition, so now let's move on. Let's keep thinking. consider the implications of that definition, the implications of what a home is and what it is for, its nature and purpose. If the purpose of a chef's knife is to cut vegetables, the knife can't be too heavy for the human hand to lift. It must be sharp enough and strong enough to cut through vegetables. So we have to think about that when we're making a knife, right? What must be true for any given home to live up to the nature and purpose of the home? What must be true for a home to be a good home, a successful home? I suggest for your thoughtful consideration that two things must be true, must be present, must be operative. The first thing might seem super obvious, but it really isn't. Those who live in the homemaker making the thoughtful observation and consideration and offering the needed care, as well as those who are the object of this attentive care, must actually be in the home so that they can be known, thought about, and cared for. Not 24/7, of course, but in the home enough to see and be seen, to know and be known, to give and to receive care. The amount of time will obviously vary depending on age and other factors. I'm not advocating 24-hour surveillance or attachment parenting. We were recently in Rome for a semester with a group of students, and one young woman always had her earbuds in. And I asked her one day, being a boomer, gently and curiously, what was up with that? Was she always listening to something? Was she trying to discourage people from talking to her? Did she find that her ears were the best place to store this technology? Sheepishly, she replied that her mother called her from back home constantly, and that it was just easier to keep them in so that she didn't have to find her phone when the calls came in. This mother may not have thought, this mother may have thought that she was always attending to her daughter's needs, constantly in contact. But in fact, she was clearly not thinking about and attending to her daughter's needs, such as her need to be present to the incredible experiences around her in Rome, or her need for independence, or her need to be emotionally present to her friends and fellow students. Her mother wasn't actually being attentive and caring. She was indulging, I would say. I haven't met this woman, but she was, in my opinion, she was indulging in her own disordered need for reassurance or control. Yes, the amount of time necessary will vary, but it must be adequate. If a house stands empty all day long, it won't be a very effective instrument, just like a knife won't be a useful knife if it never leaves the drawer. And human contact is not ensured simply by being under the same roof. It's easy for quite a few people to be in a house and not in contact with one another. I'm sure we've all experienced this, because everyone is in her room with the door shut, or absorbed in a screen, or walking around with earbuds in, or simply too distracted or self-centered to be paying attention to the other people in the same room. Human contact, contact between the caregivers and the objects of care, requires attention. Time spent in the home is pretty easy to regulate when we're talking about little children, because they pretty much have to do as they're told. But when we're talking about the needs of the older children and adults, we have to factor in that crazy thing, human freedom. At a certain point, we all have the choice of how much time we spend at home and how available we make ourselves while we are there. Does a teenager come home and immediately go to his room, slam the door, and log on, absenting himself in practice from the life of the home? Or does he hang out with others in the home, participating in family life? You can all feel guilty about your high school years right now. In my experience, a big part of parenting adolescence was learning to pay attention to the intuition that told me, something's going on with that kid. Something's not right. You didn't necessarily know what it was, but you observed something going on. And intuition isn't magic. It comes from our amazing human ability to pick up on details so small that we aren't conscious of them. We pick up on them subconsciously because we are in human contact with those we are dealing with and caring for. This factor of human freedom among older children and adults means that for a home to be successful, it needs to be attractive. And I'm not specifically talking about decor, about our homes being pretty or even especially comfortable, although this helps. But I mean literally attractive. They attract people to them. Specifically, they attract our families to them. People want to come home, want to stay home, and when they're, don't want to hide out in some isolated corner of the house, but want to participate in the life of that home. What does it take for a home to be attractive? Think about the home you grew up in and your friends' homes, but also think about your dorm room or your student apartment. There's usually one where everyone congregates, right? Why? What makes it attractive? You can think about that. Certainly the physical is important. No one finds a chaotic, dirty, stress-filled environment attractive. We naturally desire the tranquility of order, beauty, and cleanliness, a place where our needs are reliably met. We human beings come to know through our five senses, and so what is physically in our homes matters for our human flourishing. This has eternal significance. If there's beauty in the home, whether that beauty is manifest in beautiful art on the walls or in the peaceful serenity of a clean and uncluttered room, then those who live there develop a taste for beauty, which will lead them to the source of that beauty, which is God. And if contact with actual reality is given precedence over virtual reality, if people and things are given more importance than avatars and screens, then those who live in the home will develop a taste for reality, which means a taste for being, which means a taste for God, who is being himself, who is, I am who am. But more important in making a home attractive to those who live there is that there is someone there who is interested in them. And even better, a whole group of people interested in them, wanting to be there. A father who, when he comes through the door, is mobbed by happy children excited to see him, is much more likely to want to come home or to emerge from his home office than one who is immediately submerged into chaos, stress, people on the breaking point. A child whose stories and jokes and little tragedies find a willing and engaged audience is more likely to tell those stories rather than connect to social media and look for connection there. The more comfortable and welcome they feel in the home, physically, but even more important, emotionally, the more they are going to be willing and able to let themselves be seen and known, the more they're going to be able to receive care, cooperate in that care, and flourish as a result of that care. So both the culture of the home and the amount of time spent immersed in that culture matter enormously. A good home requires that those who live there, the caregivers and the cared for, and really everyone in the home should fall into both categories with the exception of helpless babies. A good home requires that both caregivers and the cared for be in the home and in contact with one another an adequate amount. Okay, additionally, a good home also needs to be organized to meet the needs of the residents. Organized. Homes don't grow in nature like an oak tree, like a habitat, and they can't be purchased online. That means that a home requires someone, a person, who pays attention to what is going on, who carefully considers the needs and the well-being of those who live in the home, and who figures out how to provide for those needs. What should be purchased? What should be rearranged? What's for dinner? What mess needs to be cleaned up? What needs to happen? What needs to stop happening? A good home requires a homemaker. A home is an instrument created, made by a homemaker. And that instrument is then used by the homemaker and by everyone else contributing to provide for human flourishing. Now, don't be put off by or drawn in by the cultural baggage of the word homemaker. I want to keep this term as pure as possible. It doesn't mean stay-at-home mom. It doesn't mean trad wife. It doesn't mean someone who loves domesticity. It doesn't even mean a woman. People read a lot of politics and ideology into just the word home in my book title. Google Books tags my book with religion, Christian living, women's interests. I didn't tell them that, right? It's like Google is assuming that, probably because of the publisher and the title. Well, don't make that mistake. I am happy to talk about ideology and to offer you my opinions, but the word homemaker as I use it and as it is grammatically constructed is neutral and even non-gendered. It's not, not male or female, right? You can be a homemaker if you are a woman or a man, a Catholic or a pagan, a homeschooling mom or an Ivy League lawyer. If you are MAGA or never Trump, homemaker means a person who does the work of keeping a house and making a home. Although this homemaker role can be filled by many different types of people, in our times, one thing must almost always be true about her. She must be thoughtful. A good and successful home requires thought, requires thoughtfulness. Now, why is that? Why can't we simply download a great app and start checking off the tasks as efficiently as possible? We adore efficiency. We demand efficiency. The idea of slowing down enough to think something through, to ponder, wonder, contemplate, puzzle over something, just doesn't seem practical in our ever so practical culture. Even you, who are here for 4 years or 3 years, if you follow your distinctive and very efficient all year round path, you're here for 4 years precisely in order to learn. You are inclined to power through your course requirements, power through your reading assignments and your problem sets, getting them done rather than being changed and formed by them. Pondering and wondering, that is, being thoughtful, seem like a luxury, one we don't have time for in our busy lives. But it is not a luxury. There are some pretty magnificent apps out there, and they are tempting. They're probably helpful as well. AI is an amazing tool, I've learned recently. At least sometimes, like figuring out whether potatoes will grow in my garden. But no app and no algorithm can make a thoughtful home. That is, a home which succeeds in fostering the human flourishing of those who live there. Why is that? Because every human being's needs are unique, fundamental and yet specific to the individual. A toddler's needs are not identical to a teenager's. An extrovert's needs are not identical to an introvert's. This is the horrible thing about being a mom, is that each kid you think, I've learned how to do this, and then the next kid is completely different, and it's all wasted. Everything you learned is not used in the next one. If those unique needs are to be met, they must be perceived and understood. And then someone has to figure out how to meet them and make sure that the plan is carried out. This happens normally in the home. This happens reliably in the home where they look at you just because you're here. Those living in a good home, a thoughtful home, are looked at, not because of what they do, but because of who they are. Husband, wife, daughter, son. Not because they've earned or merited attentive care, but because they are at home. Consequently, it needs to be true that there is someone or someones in the home who is paying attention, thinking, figuring out, and of course providing the needed care, whether providing it personally or arranging for its provision. What this someone looks like: a full-time homemaker, someone who works outside the home but is able to be present in the home an adequate amount, someone who delegates a great portion of the implementation but is nevertheless attentive and thoughtful enough to direct that delegated care, a deliberate team of caregivers. What this someone looks like can vary and has varied across eras and across cultures. But that there is someone in the home to see, know, ponder, figure out, and provide this needed care, this is required. That this is the agent we talk about, the homemaker. What I've said is pretty obvious, certainly, but there are a lot of houses where this isn't happening. Houses that might be beautiful enough to show up on an influencer's platform, houses with a home altar and an open concept and lots of natural light, but are empty all day long. And when the occupants do return, they return to an empty house or to a place where no one is really prepared to give them time and thoughtful attention. Perhaps there's a brief period of chaos and stress and some yelling and rushing, another period, perhaps not so brief, of screens and isolation, and then not nearly enough sleep on anyone's part to make it possible to be thoughtful and to pay attention, really to know each other and let ourselves be known. And if we're honest, this can happen even in a home where the homemaker is always at home, if she is rarely paying attention, rarely thoughtful, rarely available, because she is always occupied with consuming or producing content. This has not happened because homemakers and human beings are less loving, less caring, less responsible than in the past, although they are certainly more distracted than in the past. It is because the things which are necessary to a good, successful home, one which fulfills its mission, are countercultural in a new way. We are so much wealthier that survival just doesn't bring us to our senses, doesn't force us to make choices which lead naturally to human flourishing. A case in point, the family meal. For much of human history, this is how we human beings got our nourishment. We had beans and rice, which have to be cooked in order to be edible, and the effort and resources for cooking them was limited and valuable, so we made a big pot and we all shared it. But now, each of us can zap our bean burrito or pick it up at Chipotle on our drive home or get DoorDash to deliver it. And maybe that's just fine if all we care about is getting enough calories. But along with that big shared pot was human contact. an opportunity to pray together, to have a conversation, to tell stories from our day or our history, to practice serving and thinking of others. When we zap our bean burrito and eat it alone in the kitchen while scrolling, or we get the calories, but we don't get the rest of it. It takes a thoughtful homemaker to make and serve a family meal now. When I was growing up in the 60s and 70s, the daily, even 3 times daily family meal was the ordinary reality of almost every family. This was not because good mothers knew that the family meal is positively correlated with better health and better grades and negatively correlated with drug use and jail time, which it is. The daily family meal was the ordinary reality because there weren't practical options. We weren't sitting around the fire eating a big pot of rice and beans, but there was no DoorDash or Uber Eats. Fast food was in its infancy. The TV dinner, an epic step forward in replacing the family meal, required the use of a preheated oven in 45 minutes. Like that was convenience food. Restaurants were expensive. They weren't ubiquitous, and they were for special occasions or for those poor bachelors who didn't have anyone to cook for them. My mom didn't cook 3 meals a day because it was good for us. She did it because it was what everyone else did as an answer to the universal problem of hunger. But with that family meal came, unlooked for, a myriad of opportunities for human flourishing. Most fundamentally, the whole family gathered at least once a day in a natural setting where there was nothing to do but eat and converse. There were also natural opportunities to serve, to try new things, to think about others' needs, to tell a good story, or patiently listen to your little brother's tedious story, to pray, to get to know each other, to learn from each other. Now, of course, things are different. Your mothers may not have learned to cook when they were young. They may have grown up in a house where everyone ate on his own, they themselves, according to his individual likes and dislikes and according to his individual schedule. And even if your mother believed strongly in the family meal, the culture did not support it. The concept of the dinner hour has disappeared. So she had to fight against work schedules and school activity schedules to find a time when the family can gather. For many of you, I'm guessing, your experience of the family meal is maybe Sunday brunch or holiday gatherings, not a day in, day out, ordinary part of daily life. And if that's not true, if you did have that ordinary daily life family meal, then count yourself very blessed. My mother did not need to be thoughtful about her home for it to be a good home. She still had to work hard, of course, to be patient and generous and kind. She still had to struggle to be a saint. But with regard to the home, she could go with the cultural flow, follow the cultural template, and her home would be a place where human contact was ordinary and unremarkable, where sharing and listening and arguing and resolving arguments and learning how to deal with people who don't see things from your perspective was ordinary and unremarkable. I attribute this cultural change to enormous developments in technology and to a great increase in wealth when measured by standard of living. So you've likely heard that it's harder and harder to have what your parents or grandparents were able to have. You've likely heard that it's no longer possible to buy a house on a single income like it used to be. But the house that was purchased on a single income back then is a house that no one wants to buy now. It's a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house with cheap siding in a non-trendy neighborhood, without air conditioning, without Wi-Fi, without a 2-car garage, without a microwave, without a dishwasher, without an open concept family room. Our market economy has harnessed technology in the form of marketing and advertising in more and more powerful ways, exploiting our human values of independence and efficiency so that we're no longer content with a cup of coffee brewed on someone's kitchen counter, but now we require a quad espresso with extra caramel sauce and whipped cream, which we order while driving and pick up without putting our car in park. My goal here is not to criticize or bemoan or attack or defend the culture, believe it or not. It is to point out that following the culture thoughtlessly will not get you where you want to end up. It will instead get you to where the market wants you to be, a consumer who is never satisfied. And there's nothing wrong with being a consumer. If we don't consume, we will die. But remember that we are free. Animals in the wild never overeat. They don't eat poisonous berries. They don't drown because they decide it would be cool to live underwater even though they don't have gills. You really can't market to animals in the wild. But human beings can consume all sorts of things and ideas that are bad for them, can consume too much of the things that are good for them because we're free. Our culture replaces our instinct in lots of ways. It determines what we will do and consume when we aren't thinking about it. This is not a matter of left, right, wealthy, poor, Christian, non-Christian. Our consumer culture tells us that the answer to every problem is to buy something or consume something: an energy drink, an app, a kitchen appliance, a new school curriculum, a new tattoo, or a new chapel veil. We do not need to be slaves of or victims of our culture. The very human freedom which the consumer culture can exploit, is also the weapon with which we can conquer. But for this to happen, we must be thoughtful. Not merely pious, prayerful, obedient, careful, but thoughtful. We have to think about, reason about, thoughtfully consider where we are going and what it's going to take to get there, or at least what it's going to take to make progress in the right direction. Being thoughtful and making a thoughtful home is not easy. Making a home, keeping a home, running a home has always been a lot of work. It's less physical labor now than 100 years ago, but a lot of work nonetheless. But making a thoughtful home, that is taking the time and developing the focus to determine where you are going rather than riding the currents of the culture, is hard work. And it takes generosity, courage, sacrifice, and also, especially at your stage of life, clarity of purpose. It means not just having the dream of someday living on a hobby farm and homeschooling your kids, or having the dream of working in youth ministry and also raising a large family, or having the dream of working in environmental law and living with your family in a beautiful home in the suburbs. Not just having those dreams, but thinking them through. Why do I think that lifestyle will make possible the human flourishing of those for whom I'm responsible? How do I think, and my spouse, how do I and my spouse think that we will find time to be present and attentive in our home, an adequate amount to observe and tend to the needs of those who live there? Think about these things. Talk about these things. Conversation helps us think. Sharing our dreams and letting others question them. How's that going to work? Can you really see yourself living that way? But what about? Start preparing for this now. This is not just something of the future. You have a home right now, the family home that you return to during breaks, as well as your dorm room or your apartment. But it is, of course, something for the future as well, and you have the great advantage of having time to think this through, to think and prepare, to allow your ideals to shape your plans and expectations, rather than being in the trenches and in the fog of war, at which time it is much harder, but always possible, to make significant changes. So take advantage of this advantage. Start practicing now. Start practicing, sure, cooking and learning how to clean a toilet will stand you in good stead. But more important, and certainly more pertinent to your life right now, is practice thinking. Thinking about anything will help you think about everything. Think hard in your classes. Do the reading, but not just by reading the words. Think about what you're reading. Digest it. Engage the ideas. Let them impact your thinking and your choices. And don't only practice thinking and conversing. Practice human contact, spending time with people, listening to them, asking them questions, and drawing them out, even when they're a little boring or awkward. Your kids, I assure you, will have their boring and awkward moments. Maybe even your spouse will. Practice working hard and doing hard things. Practice putting your screens away and being in contact with reality. Go for a hike at Teddy Roosevelt. Make some music. Go look at the stars at night. Clearly, making a thoughtful home is going to be hard. It's going to be counterculture. But I promise you that it is worth it. We who choose to undertake this project can hope for rich rewards. When we embrace wholeheartedly the work of caring for those we have just because they're there, paying attention to them, thinking about them, being available to them, and perceiving their needs, we, by means of this work, help to form whole and happy people capable of living a richly human life. We will find ourselves living among people who know how to give us the attention and care and love which we in turn require. We will be happy to find ourselves living in a thoughtful home.